may I ask you first, Mr. Tiberghien, is this getting attention or getting affection trip made by the Prime Minister Trudeau to the United States?
Well, I don't think we can say affection or love, but this is a successful trip in the sense that there was high risk, high tension. Canadians were worried over the last months, and everything went smoothly, right? It went by the script. There has been no crisis, and the declarations are reasonable. So it puts the relationship on a good keel, and a lot of work ahead. It's not a relationship of love, but there is a good context now.
Okay, I see. From the Canadian perspective, of course, President Trump looked a little bit bored when he was reading the documents at the press conference concerning the official lines toward Canada. Mr. McArthur, you speak better English than I do, and therefore, may I ask you about the exact meaning of tweak changes to the NAFTA? Well, what does that mean, really, from the American policy?
Well, this is a word that all Canadians are wondering about today, including myself.
All right.
So the question is out there. What does it mean? But I would just say that the relationship between the two countries is so deep, and this was something that was stressed yesterday on both sides. And if one looks at the transcript, the number of positive adjectives that both sides used, including President Trump, about the relationship and the need for it to just only get better, despite the practicalities of having different views on different issues. It's because these relationships are so deep across the societies, and everyone has on both sides an economic interest for this to go very well. Remember, there's 35 states in the US, many of which voted for President Trump, that have Canada as their largest export market. They're each other's largest export markets. So they really have an incentive to get along well, and I think everyone was relieved that yesterday did seem to go quite well.
Well, if you talk about the numbers, let's take a look at some of the numbers. I did do some research, Mr. Tiberghien, and it seems to suggest Canada relies on the United States in terms of its trade and economics much more than the other way around. There are two suggestions. One is Vermont and Michigan are the only two states in the United States in which its GDP, 10% and more, are coming from trade with Canada. And yet in Canada, Ontario, more than 40%, Quebec, 22%, Alberta, 30%. Obviously, there are differences in terms of who needs whom more. How would you interpret the nature of these relations?
So I would caution against just looking at size, right? Because of course the US is 10 times bigger than Canada in terms of economy. But what matters is the fact that until last year, Canada was the first trading partner of the US. China just passed Canada, by the way, but Canada remains very, very important. Of course, for us, that means that we export 75% of our exports to the US, while the proportion for the US is much smaller. But what's really, really good, I mean, for Canada or for that context, is that the relationship is balanced. In fact, if we take goods and services, the US has a surplus of $12 billion US dollars relative to Canada. So that, and when we look at machinery or some products like this, there is a huge surplus for the US. So Canada contributes to jobs in the Midwest rather than the reverse.
Okay. We also have numbers talking about the Canadians' attitude. Canadians, particularly toward the NAFTA, they recently have a survey becoming even more supportive of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Since Mr. Trump's election victory, the latest study finds 44% of Canadians now say NAFTA has benefited their country, compared to just 25% who said this last June. Likewise, 24% now say they would like to see the deal renegotiated as demanded by their American counterpart, down from 34% last year. So, another difference we see in terms of attitude, Mr. McArthur. So, how can the Prime Minister of Canada, for example, on the one hand, renegotiate whatever tweak with his American counterpart about NAFTA, on the other hand, still got strong political support, which he cares a lot back at home? Can that be achieved on both tracks?
Well, I think it's important just to take a step back and think about the different types of issues and the different political context each country has been navigating for the past couple of years. So in the US, NAFTA is linked to immigration issues, it's linked to concerns about the border, it's linked to these questions about mechanization, which are very real, and automation of jobs. Many of them, many economists think that most of the jobs that are being lost in manufacturing are due to mechanization rather than trade, but that's a technical debate and an important one. On the Canadian side, this is much more about the first order, the trading relationship with the US. It's not about all the other issues in the same degree at all. And NAFTA hasn't been a big political fault line in Canada. There was an election in 1988, really, nearly 30 years ago, where Canada had as the frontline issue whether to have a free trade agreement with the US. That argument was had 3 decades ago. And so now people are used to this kind of, I would say, status quo, and let's make sure this works for the middle class, and let's be open to making it work better. The big question that was going into yesterday, as Yves said, I thought very wisely before, is people didn't want a disruption. People didn't want to have any overturning of the apple cart yesterday. And because these economic incentives are so aligned at the increment, that's why we saw it work well. So I think we'll see some tweaking. We'll see the fleshing out of what that means. That'll be a lot of detailed work. But crucially, President Trump said a deal that works better for both sides and improves for both sides. And I think that's what everyone's open to.
It sounds very abstract remarks, if I could tell the truth, Mr. McArthur, coming from Mr. Trump, in terms of his attitude towards some of his earlier campaign promises, for example, renegotiate or throw away NAFTA. Therefore, Mr. Tiberghien, how should we understand this? I mean, on the one hand, ideologically, it seems that Canada and the United States, at least in terms of top leadership, so many differences. NAFTA, border tax, and also how to treat Muslim refugees. On the other hand, international issues, NATO, United Nations, how to deal with Iran. These are huge differences between these two leaders. Do you think when ideologies between the two countries are so diverse on two extremes, the two will be able to nail down some win-win beneficial deals on trade and economic fronts?
I would first actually emphasize common interest, right, and common
You're
incentive.
not just trying to be diplomatic
those are
for
two
me, right?
economies that. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, if you look back a few years ago, we had the reverse in the political spectrum, right? We had a conservative prime minister in Canada, and then we had President Obama in the U.S., right? So it's normal that partisan politics goes up and down and switches left and right. So at some point you have two leaders of different political spectrum, of different sides of the spectrum. But you could see yesterday they both agreed on women leadership in business, right? That's a common interest. They both agreed on trade fundamentally, and even on immigration. I mean, Canada has not just opened its door, right? There is very high quality vetting that's happening, and that vetting is probably done with sharing of information, some degree of sharing of information with the US. So they agree on the need for vetting on immigration. Then they disagree on the quantity beyond that. So yes, they come from different parts of the ideological spectrum, but there is something when you have such common interest. And they, by the way, agree on infrastructure. Infrastructure is something that President Trump has campaigned upon, and this is something that Prime Minister Trudeau has campaigned on. So there's a few areas of fundamental agreement, and so they have to enlarge those areas, and they have to manage the others, right?
All right.
I think that with people like Minister Freeland, they know how to do it.
I hope so. And we are also joined now on the phone by Ms. Diane Francis from Toronto in Canada. She is the editor-at-large for the National Post and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ms. Francis, I do want to ask you about a very important point. That is, this year is Canada's celebrating 150 years anniversary of its establishment. And before this, the Canadian leader was talking about almost the same version as making America great again, making Canada certainly great in North America. How much do you think Prime Minister Trudeau has to find his own way on some of the key issues regarding Canada and Canada, the rest of the world, and how much he could give his space away in order to make a cordial relationship with your neighbor, the United States.
Well, I sort of agree with your previous guest, and this is something that I said on your network yesterday on the America show, is that there is no open door policy with refugees or immigration in Canada. In fact, Canada does a better job of making sure that people that come here are appropriate to come here. Refugees aside, but they're also very thoroughly checked. I'm one of many people in Canada that has sponsored a Syrian refugee family, and this is not an open door policy. So the United States, on the other hand, has been flooded with millions of people from the Western Hemisphere, uninvited, many of whom have become problems, but most of whom are fine. So they have a different historical problem with immigration than Canada does. So I think the commonality, I think the differences between Canada and the U.S. are mostly in the area of style. Think of the two countries as Canada being Scandinavia and America being Germany. They're more, you know what I mean? They're more dynamic, they're more innovative, they're more blustery, they're more direct. They throw their weight around. Whereas Scandinavia, like Canada, is more liberal, more community-oriented because we have very harsh climate. And so, but they all get along.
Okay.
So I don't think there's ever going to be loggerheads. And the other thing that's very important to note is that the two economies are merging.
Okay, I think the other guests have talked about that point. It seems that as the world changes, a lot of new types of analogies emerge every day. For example, this time comparing Canada, United States to Scandinavian countries and Germany. Having said that, though, we only have one question time left. I want to throw it back to Mr. McArthur. At this point, the Trump administration is really having a very bumpy start. And therefore, we see Prime Minister Trudeau from Canada smartly met also with the majority leader on the Capitol Hill and also the House Speaker as well. How much do you think eventually Canada would be able to really talk to the decision maker of the U.S. government, whichever branch that person is specifically coming from? How is Canada going to make that political balance?
Well, again, I think there's this tendency in human psychology to want to make everything about two opposing sides in conflict. But the reality is the working relationships are so deep across these two countries. Yesterday was the first in-person meeting of the two leaders, but their offices had been collaborating really for a couple of months. It's not a coincidence that Secretary of State Tillerson's first meeting with a counterpart was with Foreign Minister Freeland from Canada. You know, there's the Five Eyes of security cooperation, Canada, UK, US, Australia, New Zealand, cooperating deeply on security and intelligence sharing. You know, the levels of cooperation are so deep that yes, there will always be differences, but I think the most interesting and actually illuminating part of this whole past 24 hours is that people, even with somewhat and sometimes significantly different views, but here I would say it's somewhat, can cooperate. And that's what we need more of right now in a world where there's a lot of trouble cooperating. They've shown how the depths of working hard together can lead to cooperation.